Good evening. Hello, I'm Judith Angel, curator and director of Transiteshka in Bratislava. Together with Eliška Mazalanova, we are curating the Towards Other Possible Artwork program, which reflects on structural problems of the art system and focuses on bringing inspiring examples of solidarity structures, initiatives of mutual support, and cooperation within the art scene. Today, we'll concentrate on alternative economic models based on the solidarity economy. I'm welcoming our guest lecturer, Caroline Woolard and Agnes Szanyi, who will moderate the questions and answers session. Caroline is an American artist and organizer based in New York, whose work explores intersection between art and the solidarity economy. She primarily works collaboratively and collectively. She co-founded barter networks and cooperatives. She is co-author of major reports such as Solidarity Not Charity in 2021 and books about interdisciplinary collaboration, peer learning, and managing socially engaged and public art projects. Her work has been commissioned by and exhibited in major national and international museums such as MoMA, the Whitney Museum, and Creative Time. Agnes Szanyi earned her doctorate in sociology at the New School for Social Research in 2024 in New York. She investigates the intersection of art and activism and explores the struggles of artists who strive to bring change to the largely privately funded New York art world and the larger society. Before moving to New York, Agnes worked at the Budapest-based contemporary art organization Transit Hungary. Currently, she teaches at the Teachers College of Columbia University and works on a book based on her dissertation research. Thank you, Caroline and Agnes, for participation. And I would also like to thank for the support at ERTE Foundation, which is the main partner of Transit. I'm addressing also the audience. I kindly ask you that if you have questions to Caroline, please write them in the Facebook comments, and Agnes will read them during the questions and answer session. And now I am giving the floor to Caroline and Agnes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you, Agnes, for moderating afterwards. Agnes and I were in a collective for many years together, so it's really nice to be in this space with you. I'm going to share my screen soon, and I will talk for around 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then there will be around 30 minutes for the Q&A. So you can type your questions and Agnes will share them with me after the lecture. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. So you should see the screen. Yeah? It's working. Can you confirm, Agnes, you see the screen? You did, you see? Okay, great.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, so here we go. It's really a pleasure to get to share my work with you. Thank you again to Judith and Agnes and everyone who made today possible. I'm going to show you some sculpture that I make and also talk about collective projects that I am involved in. And I'm going to weave a very personal narrative throughout. To begin, I'm going to invite you to get more grounded in your body in the present by listening to the sounds created by an artist named Clara Takarabe. This is an invitation to become more fully present by listening to something called clinically designed improvisatory music. So in a moment, the screen will be black and you will hear around 3 minutes of audio that I use to go with this large sculpture. It's of a boulder that rotates. And because I work in groups and because the topic today is other art worlds or solidarity and cooperative art worlds, I like to begin the talk in the way that I begin many meetings with groups where we offer a cultural experience to one another to ground ourselves and get more present with each other through sensation or sound. So again, this is 3 to 5 minutes. It's from Clara Takarabe. It will be a black screen, and you can imagine this sound in an environment with this large boulder. And there will be silences. Silence is part of the experience. Okay. Welcome to the talk. That was again a cultural offering from Clara Takarabe, and I can share more about her in the Q&A, but I've been working with her with sound scores that help people come more fully into the present. And the way I want to structure this talk is around these two questions. These are things I ask myself a lot when I'm creating, let's say, the art worlds that I and other people want. I ask, how does a new format or a medium become available to us as artists? And how might we create new formats, new media, or new containers for audiences to engage with our ideas? Let me give you an example. I won't be able to see you raising your hand, but let's imagine if you have been to or heard of a space called printed matter, or read a zine, a magazine by artists, or an artist book. If you know of any kind of printed matter made by an artist, raise your hand, and later we can talk in the Q&A. Some people have also made artist books who are listening to this talk right now. It turns out that the history of the artist's book as a form or medium in the United States, at least, is very recent. I can thank artists like A.A. Bronson, Lucy Lepard, and many others for their work from the 1970s onward, as they created spaces like Printed Matter, the bookstore in New York City, as well as fairs made by artists, like the New York Art Book Fair, which only started in 2005, 20 years ago, or the LA Art Book Fair in 2013, just a little over 10 years old. These enable us to think of the book as a work of art in and of itself, the book as a medium. The Women's Studio Workshop near where I live in Kingston, New York, was started in the 70s and continues to support artists with art books today. Now let's think about another medium or format, the performance lecture. The history of the performance lecture is connected to the history of the artist in the academy, in higher education. What are artists doing giving lectures anyway? What is the history of me coming to you to give a talk right now? It turns out that it's only with the rise of living artists employed in universities and the idea of the BFA, the bachelor's, or the MFA, the master's, as legitimate containers for creative and conceptual development, that artists could be giving lectures like I am right now, let alone creating a performance lecture hybrid like Andrea Fraser is well known for. In fact, in the 1950s, when Harvard considered for the first time hiring a living author, it was Vladimir Nabokov, to be on faculty, the response from the chair of the department to the idea of a living writer teaching writing was this: what's next? Hiring an elephant to teach zoology for that department? For most of the 20th century, the university was a place to study the canonical works of the past, not the present, in the arts and humanities. With Agnes, who's here, I've studied the history of the BFA, the MFA, and the PhD with a collective I co-created called BFA, MFA, PhD. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So again, thinking of the book or the performance lecture, how does a format or a medium become available to us as artists? And how can we create new formats, new media, or new containers for audiences to engage with our ideas? What I want to talk about today is the ways in which I'm part of a generation that sees the collective itself and collective infrastructure in particular, such as the technology and organizational forms of mutual aid networks and worker cooperatives, as a medium, as a format, in itself, like the artist book or the performance lecture. In an era that's famously interdisciplinary, it's important to me that extended media not be confined to the use of materials and techniques like creative coding, augmented and virtual reality, animation and video, speculative design, lens-based media. I prefer that we examine how the field of art as a whole is shaped by expanded media technologies and how the field of art can shape technology and media itself. I believe we can sense this most readily by studying infrastructure that's made by and for artists and other precarious workers. So in the talk, which we're already in, I'm going to share a little bit of media, video, sculpture, and installation work that I've made, talk a little bit about my personal history and how I got into this, share some things that I've written, and give you a structure for thinking about making infrastructure in the arts. The very short version, TLDR, like too long, I didn't have time to read it, is I believe that artists in this time can make discrete artworks like sculptures and also platforms for the circulation of artworks and ideas. In other words, we can make things and also make the platforms or the networks for our things to circulate. And we might call these platforms an emerging medium, a kind of infrastructure for collectivity, like the medium of the artist book or the performance lecture. Okay, so what does this mean for you if you're watching this lecture right now? I'm asking you to consider this prompt. Where do the things you make want to go? Think of something that you made recently. It could be a drawing, a book, a game, anything you made. And where might it want to end up? Does it want to live in a museum, a home, a parking lot, a garden, a library, a Discord channel? And who might help it get there? A roommate, a curator, a publicist, a community member, a librarian? Think about it for a moment. When I'm working, I'm considering this whole process. I'm thinking about the thing itself, whether it's a sculpture or someone who's helping distribute it, and a location. This is how I'm making things and networks for distribution. I want to talk about both. So for example, I have made sculptures that circulate in mutual aid and barter networks. I've been involved in founding co-ops for permanently affordable space. And most recently, I co-founded a national network in the United States called Art.coop for worker-owned art and design collectives and cooperatives. And at the bottom, there are different publications that I've co-authored that you can access. We can put the links in the Facebook chat later. And all the while making sculptures, making discrete things that circulate in these networks. The artwork that I make often moves through these spaces, mutual aid spaces, co-op spaces, and DIY, do-it-yourself spaces. So as I'm in the studio, I'm thinking, how do I distribute these things that I make? When should I critique a network? And when might I create a network that I want? But how did this approach begin? Well, some of you are likely wary of personal biography as an entry point to understanding art for good reasons. I've decided to share some of my lived experience to break up the more theoretical aspects of this lecture. I don't want this to be a typical talk. I want you to have a sense of what brought me here, also as an individual, a very specific person with my own history. So here we go. This is a video that I made about time. It is a never-ending hourglass. It never runs out. What can time tell? A concrete pillow holds a pool of water, reflecting up. Placed on wet clay, a mushroom at one end, and a single bulb lighting the pool of water overhead. The woman that I'm named for, Caroline Woolard was her name, waited 30 years to see her son again. 30 years. Even the preacher told her to grieve her son. He said, "Your son is dead. Let's have a funeral." Her friends begged her to give up, but she waited for her son. She stopped going to the preacher's church and she kept waiting for her son. The hourglass on an infinite loop shown here is in an installation. The idea is that timekeeping devices are always time-producing. So rather than understanding time as neatly divisible, linear, and disciplinary, this project begins with the premise that certain practices and sculptural objects could offer us an experience of an alternative and intimate time, a time marked by our engagement with one another. And as the story goes in my family, one day, 30 years later, her son returned. He was 30 years older, but so clearly her son. She had been waiting. She rocked on the porch, chewing tobacco in North Carolina, grinning with the few teeth she had left. It turned out her son had 2 sons of his own now. Water clocks work like this. One large vessel is made and filled with water. On the water's surface, a smaller vessel is placed. An interval has passed when the bowl sinks to the bottom of the larger bowl. This is part of a sculpture with 5 tables that are placed in a pentagonal formation. Each table resembles the she-wolf that raised Romulus and Remus. I made a cherrywood table with bent hind legs of steel, distended udders of stoneware, and a hanging mirror for a face. The she-wolf's breasts have been filled with water for the water clock I described. Again, a delicate bowl with a single hole is placed in the breast of the she-wolf, sinking to the bottom to mark a duration that is unknown. Later, my namesake, Caroline Woolard, heard how her son felt when he had to leave her. He told her he didn't want to watch his mom work so hard to care for him. His dad had died in the Great Flu pandemic, and it was the Great Depression. He went looking for work. He was 16 years old. He worked on coal mines. He worked on farms. Eventually, he tried to rob a gas station for money, and he failed. He went to prison. He changed his last name and told himself he had no family. He joined the military with a new name. He became Norman Wheeler, not Norwood Woolard. He got married, and even his own wife didn't know about his mom, my namesake, still waiting. But when he had children, it became too hard. He took his son into his room and told him the story. He did have a family. He did have a mom. And they drove to North Carolina that day to the tobacco fields where Caroline Woolard worked, where he had worked as a kid. They all got baptized again in the river, and even the preacher showed up. Caroline's son was alive. And they were Woolards again now. They returned to the fields to work those long days where the boys would drop off from the nicotine and the heat on the tobacco farm. They were poor again, and they were home. Here's a rendering of a 3D printed water clock. At time, a rendering is no longer a representation or a plan, but instead the file for production itself. Because timekeeping devices are always time-producing devices. Again, rather than understanding time as neatly divisible, linear, and disciplinary, this work begins with the premise that certain practices and sculptural objects can offer an experience of an alternative and intimate time. That woman who never gave up, my great-grandmother, my namesake, was Caroline Woolard. My dad named me after her. And the man who changed his last name, robbed a bank, and failed, that's my grandfather. the boy he took into his room to reckon with poverty and shame and naming. That was my dad. My dad was born with a made-up last name. When he heard his new name, he turned it around in his mouth, saying this strange name again and again. Woolard, Woolard, Woolard. And my dad would flee too. He ran away as a teenager like his dad had done. And I never met my namesake, but that's a story for another time. Here's a work that transforms materials long associated with solidity and permanence, brick and stone, into hollow vessels that can hold and release water. These objects are inspired by a medieval watering can, an object with a single hole on top that is submerged in water, capped with a thumb, and then released at will. The translation of the name from French is to sing and to weep. And my dad had kept this story a secret from me for a long time. The story of my namesake, the story of being born with a made-up last name, and my grandfather's failed robbery, until I was a teenager. He didn't talk to me about how he had been drafted too, to join the military. Instead, he put me in private school. He wanted me to feel comfortable around people he didn't feel comfortable around. He grew up without running water, working the tobacco fields. His idea was that I would grow up to be a doctor or a lawyer. Then one day, I said to my dad, I want to be an artist or a farmer. And I went to work at Soulfire Farm, pictured here. His face dropped. He said, how are you going to support me when I'm old? And I didn't have the words for it at the time, but I do now. So I'll speak to you as I wish I had spoken to him. There is knowledge in the material I know, in this water, in these forms, in these experiences I offer in art. He told me I was stupid, passionate, stubborn, or crazy for wanting to be an artist, that I lived in my imagination, but I went into art anyway. And my persistence became part of my strength, part of my internal power that no one can take away from me. He named me after Caroline, didn't he? And she waited 30 years. Many of us in this space who were told not to go into the arts did it anyway. Yes. And as we know, in the US, there are more artists than doctors, police officers, and lawyers combined. And all of us have this internal strength, this persistence, this passion, this imagination, this embodied knowledge that no one can take away from us. That's part of our strength, our power. On the one hand, I laugh at systems of measurement and control that tell me, as an artist, you have no value. I know my dignity. I can live in the present and live with the pleasure of sensation and reciprocal care in the spaces I co-create. I have knowledge that when I say I don't know, it can also be related to feeling that we're all connected and that we can communicate with more than just words, that we can be joyful in the unknown. And on the other hand, I know that I have to pay rent. I know we have to survive in the system as it is today while we transform it. So I laugh at my dad and at measurement, and I also make art. I also make systems and narratives for a future where art is valued, where I'm valued and where we are valued. I do a lot of work with other people who have this persistence and this vision, this internal power, and that's where platforms come in. In the fiscal crisis of 2007 and 2008, I co-created this learning system called Trade School, where people could meet one another to share their skills that could not be taken away from them, even when they lost their jobs. We would swap our skills and learn together for over a decade. People would sign up. It functioned for many languages in many locations. and it spread to 30 cities internationally. The code was also open source, so anyone could use and adapt it, and even the annotation system aimed to be poetic. Critical theory teaches us that the work we make always reflects the political economy that we live within. Trade School was made during the crisis of 2007 and 2008. So what is the moment we're living in now? The truth is that no one knows what arts and culture is going to look like after this pandemic is really over. We know that in the US, 63% of artists became fully unemployed, and that the annual median wages for artists was $48,000 in 2016 and $53,000 in 2022, which is well below a livable wage in the US. And the real average hourly earnings of workers in any field, the line that you see in blue, has not increased since the 1970s. We also know that a third of museums are struggling to open. Many of them will remain closed forever since 2020. And this is why I say I can't ignore the political and economic conditions that shape my dad's imagination about what's possible for me as an artist. And I can't ignore the conditions that shape my subject position, that shape the fields of art and design. My dad being afraid that I'm an artist is due to the context we live in. As an artist, I must consider the historical forces, the institutions and rules, the community and media, and my intimate networks as they shape my beliefs and my ability to imagine something else. And yet there is another way. This is a pop quiz for people in your life, if they exist, that told you not to be an artist. What do these organizations and movements have in common? The oldest Native cooperative, the first democratically managed investment fund, the oldest non-extractive venture capital firm, an organization that gives 35,000 freelancers pensions, and the movement for Black lives. They were all started by artists. So Koala Arts and Crafts is the oldest Native worker-owned business in the US. It's a craft cooperative. The Boston Ujima Project is the first democratic investment fund, and it places arts and culture at the center. I encourage you all to look it up. It might inspire you coming from the US. And the Working World is a non-extractive firm. It gives loans with very low interest or zero interest to many worker cooperatives in the Americas. And Smart.coop, you might already know about, allows freelancers to get access to benefits and pensions by pooling their income through one entity. And Patrice Cullors, who co-founded the Movement for Black Lives, is an artist. It turns out that all around the US, and likely where you are as well, artists and culture bearers who have been most harmed by our current systems of neoliberal governance and racial capitalism are practicing self-determination and community wealth. For those of you who like definitions, this is about the solidarity economy. While practices of equitable and sustainable self-determination and community control are rooted in a myriad of ancestral and community norms, the term solidarity economy is relatively contemporary. The term solidarity economy emerged in Chile and France in the 1980s, gained popularity in Latin America in the 1990s, and spread globally as an interdependent movement after the first annual World Social Forum in Brazil in 2001, which popularized the slogan, "Another world is possible." Many of you have seen this diagram from the Just Transition movement, and if you haven't, I encourage you to look up the Just Transition, which essentially looks at the movement from an extractive economy with a consumer and colonial mindset to one that is regenerative with caring and cooperation and deep democracy. At some point, reading critical theory, I learned that the tension between art and life, between a wage and a livelihood, is as old as capitalism. It is capitalism. And I realized that I've been feeling bodily what so many people have felt for over 400 years. It's only in this economic system, capitalism, that art confronts the world as separate, as symbolic, and non-reproductive. It's only with the rise of capitalism that art is cast out of the world of daily life and rendered newly useless.
And this is what the Kapsanyama really asks us to think about.
I was told that video might have a challenge on Facebook Live, so you can, on your own, look at this site, Marks for Cats, which I made for fun with the theorist Claire Laberge, who also wrote a book of the same title, where she explains Marxist theory to cats. And it's both a fun project and one where you can learn more about Marxist theory. And I also got to make a pattern and a print that we use on the book and in clothing and installations. Even Martha Rossler, pictured here, got into it. So if, as J.K. Gibson Graham says, that to change ourselves is to change our worlds, and the dynamic is reciprocal, then the project of history making is never distant. It's always happening on the edges of our thinking, feeling, moving bodies. Then what do I long for? I want non-verbal ways of knowing, which have been exiled, ways of feeling, hearing, tasting, smelling, seeing, and more, to be valued in communication, in work, and in so-called non-art spaces. As artists, I believe we can communicate without words. And I want to continue the intergenerational work, which made it possible for me to go to art school for free at Cooper Union. I want to come out of a pandemic with more cooperative and caring institutions to support the people who have been most harmed. I want to make objects that prefigure the experience of life that we could have in the art worlds we want. What if this generation, I don't have to flee? Even though my grandfather left and my father left, what if I can stand and stay? I'm coming home to myself and in collectives each day. And I split my work across these areas, making videos or sculptures, projects, and also distribution platforms. You can think of projects as things like videos or reports, and platforms as systems, networks, and institutions. For example, here is a sculpture called A Stone Holds Water, another sculpture called Tantalus, another sculpture, Imperial Forms, a ceiling tile net, countermeasures, a water table. All of these works move through the platforms I've described. There are ways of telling time and acting differently as we build collective infrastructure. To give you an example, at art.coop, the national network of arts cooperatives, I've been bringing in timekeeping devices, working with core organizer Marina Lopez to consider how the water-based sculptures I make can be used in convenings. We are a horizontally run group of mainly women and non-binary people. There's 9 of us, and since 2021, we've been creating narratives and working together to resource the cooperative movement in the arts. So what does it take to do both? To make projects in your studio and also platforms. You might have conventional studio-based tools, but you might not know what you need to learn or who you can learn with in order to make a platform. I think of it as less of a binary and more of a flow, from daily practices to multi-year work to short-term projects. So think of the things you make as an artist as a project, like the fruit on a tree. It is delicious, but it is short-lived. I think of a project as something made with an imagined audience that's larger than the artist or the group involved in the effort of creation. And then platforms are like the trunk of that fruit tree. It should be strong and enduring. It's a multi-year initiative that wants to reproduce itself in order to provide support for projects and people. And then you can think of the daily practices that are required to nourish this fruit tree. The roots or mycelium that are underground and life-giving. A practice is a way of doing things regularly on a daily basis, potentially, to develop an ability or awareness. So as you're thinking about where the things you make want to go, I invite you to consider it with what you've just heard from me anew. And again, I've answered this question for myself by making different platforms that we can talk about in the Q&A, everything from a peer-to-peer learning platform to one for affordable space, to art.coop. And there are books and publications that I've co-authored that you can look at as well. There are also art objects that we can talk about. And this is a list of many initiatives that I've been involved in. I really believe that we can consider a platform as an emerging medium, a kind of technical and social infrastructure for collectivity, like the artist's book or the performance lecture. A large way to think about it is, how do we get from a system that does not value artists and most working people to a future that we want to be in? I'll describe my process briefly and then we'll go into the Q&A. So I tend to look at the historical moment that we're in, do research to understand shifts underway. With art.coop, it meant writing a report and then creating a space of learning, because history is made, of course, by people in dialogue with one another. And I think artistic movements need to happen in groups. They can't be just nice ideas that individual artists have. And then from those learning spaces, often a group of people forms with shared enthusiasm and skills, and we create a group. Then we tend to do tests and try out ideas and make a platform, always considering how it's mediated and how it might move in the world. But of course, this is never a linear process. It looks much more like this. And if you're someone in the studio unsure about what this might look like, imagine that you start by knowing your materials and what they can do. And then you begin to ask yourself, who could I work with on the next project? Can we work together? And then you might ask, what institutions and networks and economies are you moving through? How could you consider the way art circulates? And again, we can get into this more in the Q&A, but you can look at the circulation of art. This is by Lizzie Mogul, and consider how nonprofit and for-profit art worlds function. This is a sketch to consider how a solidarity art economy might look, where co-op members are financing cooperatives, with community-based organizations and movement organizations and government support involved. It's very much a sketch. We can talk about it in the Q&A. I love to study maps of the art world. There are many here. Adelheid Mayers, William Pauhaida, Lizzie Mogul. You could convene other artists to think about existing circulation modes and what you want to change, and then work to understand the histories and present conditions of those systems, and to think about current efforts underway, and to discern when to accept or resist what exists. Sometimes we can create something else. And so I'll go very quickly through this so we have time for the Q&A. For example, I once made this rocker. It's out of a single sheet of plywood. It matters to me that it's an open source file that people in makerspaces can adapt, and that there was a zine related to it, and that I made it while living in a DIY space with other artists, and that I created a website for people to consider how to work together. This is study collaboration. And I began to build my persistence and my skills with self-care, research methods, facilitation skills, community organizing skills, and also graphic design and organizational development skills. So again, if you're interested in the teaching and learning side of this, I can share with you that I've been teaching this for a while at a number of places, and I'm going to go more quickly through this, but there is a book that I wrote with Susan Jahoda in relationship to the collective I was in with Agnes. It's called Making and Being, and you can go to the website and see the book is available for free there with a card game. To close, I ask you to consider moving from a formal approach to your work where you're looking at your materials and your shapes, or if you're a conceptual or research-based artist focusing on the themes that you're working on or the context that you're working in if you're socially engaged, to looking at where the things you make might want to go. In the book, we'll give you many prompts if you want to be in a teaching and learning space. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but it's at makingandbeing.com. And we do many events. There's a book related to a bigger platform. So yeah, to close, I want to say, for me, this is not separate from my day-to-day life. I'm living now in community with Susan Jahoda from the book, who is from the collective with Agnes. This is my son here in our construction space as we build a chosen family and collective art making practice here. And for me, making objects and pairing that with sound, like what you heard from Clara Takarabe, is a way to be more fully present when I'm in collective practice. So as I asked at the beginning, how does a new format or medium become available to us as artists? The artist book and the performance lecture were created within the lifetime of your professors, your mentors, possibly your favorite artists. So we can create new formats. Here are some of the ways that I've tried to do that, and some books you could look at. And again, the projects you're making could have platforms that they want. I invite you to consider doing that with websites, objects, installations, and invitations to join whatever you're doing. Again, let's not confine this interdisciplinary work to the use of materials and techniques. Let's consider how the field of art as a whole can be shaped, because artists in the 21st century can make discrete artworks, but also platforms for the circulation of artworks and ideas. And this, in fact, could be an emerging medium. So what if the systems around us did not need to be this way? What if we could open them up and play with them and reimagine the infrastructure around us? Thank you so much. I'm excited for the Q&A. Let me know what people are writing.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It was a very interesting and I think very useful presentation of your work specifically for the Slovak context. I really find your work so inspiring because you are doing I should say the opposite of what we learn artists are trained for, or the art world is about, or what I can see that art schools are still very much focusing on, which is creating artists who are very competitive. They have to be ready for a very competitive environment, especially in the US, but I think this is true for other countries as well. Also to focus on the individual work, take credit for everything. And I think, and as I think you also experienced this throughout your education, that learning to collaborate, learning to share and also care for each other, and working together on projects or goals is not really a goal toward or during the art education that the artists usually get in art schools. Maybe in Eastern Europe it's a little bit different, especially because in Eastern Europe the art market is not so prominent as in the US. So I think that might be specifically more true for the US. But I find it very inspiring that all this time that you have left Cooper Union, you have been really focusing on creating collaborations, creating communities, and sharing not just credit, but goals and lifestyles. And every project that you do is always about gathering people around you and sharing goals together towards a different art world and things that we can imagine that artists are supposed to do, imagine worlds differently or a new world. So one thing I wanted to ask, and I think this attitude or this approach is even more important now in the US, and specifically if we are talking to the Slovak context, in a context where funding is dwindling from the state, from public institutions. There is less and less funding, and at the same time there is no existing private sponsorship built around art as it would be in the US, or as there is in the US, many different layers. It has a long history for better or worse. We can also maybe discuss this later, but even that layer is missing in Eastern Europe, specifically in Slovakia, but in Hungary as well, where I'm from. So I could see this happening, like the sucking out of the air from the art world after political changes and turn to a more right-wing government or political culture. So I thought that maybe through the example of art co-op, maybe you can tell more about how art co-op became, what's the goal of art co-op, because art co-op also talks to grant makers, or it talks to people who have the funds, who have the possibility and means to maybe support art. So I think it would be an interesting first question to ask you to talk more about art.coop.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think one of the challenges of something that might be considered an alternative is to wrestle with the possibility of being so-called mainstream, or finding support in a way that requires visibility and recognition from dominant and more conventional institutions. There's literature on like the institutionalization of alternative art practices. And in a way, what I was saying with the New York Art Book Fair is a way of moving from something that's like embryonic, where people have all different terms for a practice and they're not connected together, to institutionalizing it in a way that it can have an art fair for books, and that everybody, a lot of people, can identify with that term and that approach and find kind of cultural and social capital associated with that way of making. Okay, so we want to do that with cooperative practice in the arts, especially in the United States. And one way that we put it is, what if we could have something like the MacArthur Genius Award for the group? Because the group would be the fundamental unit of recognition and care and value. And one way that we think strategically we can do that is by getting the grant makers, the government grant makers, and also the private grant makers in the United States to recognize and financially support collectives and groups and cooperatives. So yeah, we made this report for grant makers in the arts. That's the national professional community for grant makers. Everything from a local arts agency that is in the government to a national foundation like the Mellon Foundation or the Ford Foundation, these private foundations that are a big part of the US arts ecosystem. We wrote this report by interviewing all of them and asking them what they wanted in 2020 and what was possible in 2020. And we heard that many people who work within these institutions are looking to do something else, but they don't know how. And so we started gathering these people together to be in conversation with each other and with artists who work in collectives, to have some system of accountability around the changes that they want to make. And many of these arts foundations now give money to collectives. And so we can see a shift within the grant-making community, and also with many social movement organizing bodies, like the New Economy Coalition is a coalition in the US of 400 co-ops, time banks, etc. They also are now prioritizing artists and arts collectives. So we like to say, like, the movement needs artists and artists need the movement, and we can have them recognize each other more. So do political education to more conventional artists, which we also do, and then to make partnerships with social movement-based groups to bring in artists and also give money to artists. And then we also have the more dominant institutions like grant makers who really want to change, but they don't know how. So yeah, we advise them, and we do a monthly event called Move the Money. It's very clear in the title, and we have arts cooperatives presenting to funders, grant makers from that network who are considering how to support these groups. So yeah, it's a much more strategic approach, looking at the institutions that have the power and responsibility to make more dominant ecosystem changes than I used to do. I used to be not interested in working with those institutions. And I don't know, at some point I realized, hey, a lot of my friends are now employed in these places. You know, it's more complex than I thought. Like, they have a day job. They also have a political agenda. Maybe we can make these institutions change, because actually artists need work too. And many of them work in these institutions. We can find allies and we can shift the power dynamics.
Thank you. So actually, I guess this is also the core of what an alternative art world based on a solidarity economy could begin to look like. Can you maybe explain a bit more in your like in your imagination, because I guess an artwork based on solidarity economy exists in smaller pockets, but how would this look like in maybe a larger scale, like maybe even for people who are now at a point where, because of the political crisis and because everyone looking for alternative possibilities, they are looking for ways to build a system. In the case of Slovakia, I think it's maybe even more doable because it's a smaller art world. Maybe not, I'm not sure, but how would that look like an artwork based on solidarity economy?
Wow, I love this question. I need to ask this also to everyone at Art.coop to see what their version of it is, because what will come out in the response is from, if you asked a group, is the relationship to the state. Some people will take no interest in state support for a solidarity economy in the arts, and we'll want it to be autonomous and more of a grassroots approach permanently. And other people like me will be more comfortable with some amount of support from the state. So I'm going to give you my version, but this is the debate. The debate of the solidarity economy is if it's an umbrella term that can hold many visions of a post-capitalist world, how much should that post-capitalist world be structured with state entities, and how much should it absolutely be self-organized and never in relationship to a state discourse, understanding, way of arranging power. So anyway, some people will say my response is very conservative because of that. But personally, I think that we could have, I'm talking about in the US system, more consistent support for permanently affordable housing and studio space and workspace for artists that is also subsidized and reinforced through policy and regulation by the government. This is possible. You can see it in other countries, like what Mondragon in the Basque Country has been able to achieve. There is a lot of incentive for culture and education, for example, like the industrial cooperatives have to give a percentage every year of a huge budget to art and culture. And so that enables them to have this automatic fund for permanently affordable space and housing for artists. You can also make low interest loans a priority to arts and culture from the banking institutions that can be government run. This is also possible in the Basque Country and also in Montreal. You can look at their banking and the way they support artists with very low interest loans for their initiatives. And then I think on a basic level, we would have courses taught by more than one person. All courses would be co-taught, or they would be taught by a collective to have that feeling of a variety of voices. And we would have funds for artist-run infrastructure that are regularly put out, and the priority would be given to groups connecting with one another to share their work and distribute their work. A simple way that I put it is like, imagine that you have no boss, you work with other people in your workplace, you have no landlord, you are part of a group that organizes your housing or your studio, and you don't have to take on an enormous amount of debt in order to live your life. It might be different there, but here that's the case for most people. And that we can consider ways to see each other as the primary resource rather than somebody far away who has a locked, gated opportunity. Another way to make it very simple is to ask artists the next time they consider applying for a grant or applying for an opportunity, to use those hours, like 4 hours, 6 hours, to help somebody else with a project. Just one time each year. So many times you will apply for a grant. Fine, you'll take your 6 hours. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. The 6 hours are gone. But one time you will absolutely get help for your work, and you will give somebody else help, and you will make something. And that is guaranteed. You will have challenges working with each other, but at least you know those 6 hours went to making art. That is like the fundamental approach of mutual support. That is a cultural shift, and it can also be a financial shift if there are larger entities with regulations that require group work be the primary support entity. Yeah.
Thank you. This actually leads to my other question. In your experience, what are the practices that artists and people who are working together in a solidarity economy, how can you keep up the solidarity? Like it's
Yes.
maybe a question that is not exactly how it should sound, but what are the practices that you can use to maintain collaboration when there are conflicts, or also because we are not trained to collaborate, I think, even in Eastern Europe either. So what can you say to artists who are looking into working more collaboratively?
Yeah, I love this question. This is the hardest part, and I think this is why people shy away from it. I think there's a number of things that I would say. The first one is every time you have a challenge in a group, don't assume that that means group work cannot function well. There are just as many violences and challenges when you have a boss or when you work alone. So compare the worst thing that you experienced with an employer and the worst thing that happened when you were trying to do things alone, and then look at what was hard in the collective. And you can see that there are challenges in both. Because some people imagine in a group, all of a sudden, all of those problems will go away. But actually, structural violence is reproduced interpersonally. So all of the things we're trying to solve will come out in the group. And there are many different group structures. I'd also say, like in art.coop, we're very interested in being a flat organization. So in that space, I think it's so important for people to learn how to work together, even if they don't like each other. So we have a lot of policies around getting our mission clear and working toward that mission, so that even if we don't like each other, we can hopefully find arrangements where some people don't even have to be on the same working group. They aren't. They will not be in the Zoom with each other, but they can find a way to still work toward the mission and shift away from each other if they can't be in the space. And accepting that we will not all be friends because what we're doing is working on something greater than the people in the group. That's one approach, because it's hard to balance the amount of healing that needs to happen interpersonally with the work that you want to do. So it also depends on your goals. If your goals are about transforming the members of the group, you can balance that self-care and collective care with working. But if you have a national agenda, then you can't do as much of the interpersonal healing. That is my personal opinion. I would say also look at different structures. Like right now, I'm working on this thing, pollinator.coop. And in that structure, we are incredibly procedural and clear about a hierarchy of information flows and decision making. So we do not come to consensus on most things. There are very few decisions that all 5 of us need to talk about. They're really about money. That's it. Everything else, we have a clear flow of who is in charge of that. And honestly, it's a big relief after coming from art.coop, where we all talk about everything. It seems like there are very few decisions that we can remove ourselves from. We're like working on that. So there's more room for interpersonal drama. In this one, it's like I'm just working in my area, you're working in your area, and we can move very fast. I think artists have a lot to learn from other organizers, labor movements, etc., about the balance of efficiency and relationship building. But yeah, this is the core tension. And I think believing that you're going to find friends or even lovers in your collective is often at odds with producing something greater than the members. And that is the tension.
Thank you. And I have one more question. I think we have time for one more, and also I don't see any question right now from the audience. So I wanted to ask one more thing. So because you are working with grant makers and you see different models of funding also around the world in the US. So in a scene where your preferred funding, which would be some part of state or some state funding, might not exist anymore or for a while because of the political direction a government is taking. And we also know from the American and the example of the UK that completely rely on private funding, meaning corporate funding, has its own dangers as well. Like privatizing culture is something that's happening or has happened very much in the US and happening in the UK as well. And it has other problems than relying on state funding. So what would be the, if we are thinking about creating a new grant-making community, what would be an ideal way of granting or funding, sponsoring solidarity economy that tries to balance and exclude these dangers of these previous models?
Well, one version would be there is no money, and then it's really about mutual support. And you can find different models for this, like whether it's a time bank where you track different people's time supporting on each other's projects, or mutual support with no transactional ledger, just help each other. I think there are many ways to say, I'm going to help you on your project, and then you help my friend, and then they help me. We can find this. But if you're interested in one that moves actual money through the system, I think looking at the Basanujima project that I mentioned, it's a pretty interesting model that could be applied to other contexts, and you can contact them also, and they do consulting to help people set this up. It's essentially neighborhood assemblies where there are different local small businesses that people nominate that have certain values and alignment. They all will be in this ecosystem with different assemblies, and the neighbors come together to vote on what could get money. It can be a loan that gets paid back if it's for a business, or a grant if it's for artists. And they have given a lot of money away to artists with these different neighborhood assemblies. And then they have a big pot of money that all of the assemblies can access, where corporate funders and private funders can put in money, but they cannot vote on who gets the money. So they are like the non-voting members in the cooperative. And then the voting members have to be from those local assemblies in order to vote on who receives the money. There's still a lot of challenges because not everyone has time to vote. Not everyone is informed enough to vote. It takes a lot of time to make these local assemblies function, and the majority of that will be uncompensated labor. That is the nature of a democratic experiment. And so there are pros and cons in being fully participatory, but I do think it's shifting a culture in Boston around the way art is valued, because they give grants to artists, and those artists come from the different local assemblies, and people who are artists are working with local businesses in different ways than they would have before. So that would be one way to look at it. But I think in general, without state or private support, it's mostly a non-monetary support ecosystem. And that means necessarily people are fitting it in between their family and their work. And it is difficult. But when more and more people are unemployed, like we also have in the US, people do have time. And people do find a lot of meaning and skill building and recognition from putting their talent and their time into these efforts. Like they really are looking for a place to use their time while they don't have a job. So a lot of things I've done are also in those moments where, yeah, people are unemployed and they want community and they want to share their skills. So you can organize that.
Thank you. And if there are maybe organizations that are interested to step in this vacuum that maybe is created in some of these Eastern European countries, another way to maybe work with them is what you did with art.coop, like informing grant makers or people who are interested in supporting, like what are the ways that we can build a system maybe much more sustainable than just project-based. And actually your report, I think we can share that later in the video on YouTube probably, but the Solidarity Not Charity PDF is a very good source for like thinking together with grant makers and grant givers and supporters, like how to think differently about funding and fundraising.
Yeah.
So
there are people
thank you so
looking
much.
yeah, I can say just for the future, there are people looking like in Europe. I know a number of funders who are asking like where in Eastern Europe can we support? So there are still, it has problems because it's private philanthropy, but they are aware that they need to support a lot of work that's happening in Eastern Europe and looking like who should we support? Yeah.
That's a very interesting new trend. I think it's good to explore more. Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Judith, for organizing this. I think it has a lot to. We talked about a lot of things, or Caroline especially, that we should think about for the future, and hopefully it's giving hope and useful for the Slovak context as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.